Thank you very much for those kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. I was a New Zealand citizen by virtue of my parents having been refugees from China during the Second World War, fleeing the Japanese, and so I'm sure they had no idea that the ship was going to make landfall in New Zealand. But because it did, I grew up there, left at a very early available opportunity and came here for graduate school, and then went off to Africa for a very great number of years, doing a very great number of very interesting things. But because of my Chinese background, it means that I somewhat startle the Chinese authorities when I turn up in Beijing on the negotiating side of the African delegations. This has a great psychological benefit for the African negotiating delegations, as you can imagine. And of course, it's further compounded by the fact that as far as Chinese people go, I look very unconventional. So the idea that this is somehow a serious scholarly person is belied by the fact of the very long hair and the designer suits and things of that sort. So they've come up with a formula that I'm sort of Chinese and that I must once upon a time have been an artist, and that explains everything. So the Chinese have this habit of trying to adjust their world vision according to stereotypes. That's my stereotype. Their learning curve in not viewing Africa in terms of stereotypes was a long one. So when I first started doing this work on behalf of Africa in China, the early visits to Beijing, we're going back about 15, 17 years ago now, were very bewildering for me because of the huge lack of what you would call density and detail of an accurate sort in their research. So ministers and delegations with whom we were negotiating would be coming to the table totally unprepared in terms of the actuality of what was happening in Africa. Now, visit by visit, you could see almost visible improvement every single time. So the last time I went to Beijing, we were working at the level of the Prime Minister's State Council. And I have to say, their research on Africa now is better than what the Foreign Office here is producing. I spent a lot of time in the Foreign Office. We've got nothing on what the Chinese now have in terms of capacity to gather intelligence and to interpret intelligence, and then to use it in terms of policy formation. Policy formation in China is a very difficult, multi-layered affair. You've got not only the government and competing arms within the government, obviously the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, obviously the Prime Minister's department, but all of this can be very easily second-guessed by parallel institutions in the party. The party is probably significantly senior to the government. It takes a very senior government personage, such as the Prime Minister himself, for instance, to break through this kind of policy strangle-lock that the party echelons can have on government policy formulation. And then, of course, there's the voice of the People's Liberation Army. So, for instance, the new Chinese profile in peacekeeping in Africa, notably in Sudan, for instance, including in Darfur, that involved very, very much agreement on the part of the People's Liberation Army to participate in this kind of venture that we would think to be highly desirable, but it was a very laborious decision that the Chinese had to arrive at. So the idea of a slowly progressing expertise, but all the same a very laborious decision-making process, really does need to be factored into the way we look at China in Africa. Now, having said all that, the way we look at Africa also needs to be nuanced quite considerably from our old view of it. 55 separate countries, that's 55 recognized by the African Union, 54 because the Sahrawi People's Republic is not internationally recognized. And of course, there are great quarrels within the African Union. Morocco lays claim to that part of Western Sahara, and so is in and out of the African Union itself in protest or otherwise at the policies of the African Union. But whether 54 or 55, what this means is that trying to make policy for a continent that vast and with so many differences. By our count at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and this can only be an estimate, we think some 2,000 different languages, not dialects. Obviously, there are cognate words that are in common among several of the languages, but 2,000 discrete languages, 2,000 cultures, perhaps 2,000 epistemological ways of working through what we would call, in a very generic sense, rationality. How do you do all of this? How do you have an approach to a continent that is probably the most diverse continent in the world, and one modernizing in a very, very rapid way, modernizing in terms of very, very different examples and different templates. So the way they're doing things in the former Lusophonic colonies, places like Angola, Mozambique, for instance, it's very, very different to the way that the Anglophonic former colonies would do things. And the British model is not the same as the Portuguese model. And of course, neither is the same as the Francophonic model. So all kinds of different influences and all kinds of desires to cut one's own path, irrespective of foundation models. And in trying to cut one's own path, of course, what the Chinese have to offer becomes not so much beguiling, but of interest. How do the Chinese do it? So the search for templates by which modern government can take place is key. Modern government can only take place, of course, if there's the public administrative capacity and, above all, the infrastructure by which you can execute government policy. When I was monitoring the elections in Sudan in 2010, shortly before the independence of South Sudan, but I did it from South Sudan, this is a country the size of Germany. I counted 11 kilometers of paved road in the entire country. We laboriously measured it. I have a very stupid interest in pedantic things of that nature. But what does this mean? It means that in the rainy season, government, in terms of provision of services, in terms of provision of security, is impossible. The dirt roads are flooded. There's not enough by way of aircraft. There are no landing strips anyway that are reliable in the wet weather season. There are no railways in South Sudan worth speaking about. And those 11 kilometers of paved road back in 2010, the situation has changed right now, thanks in part to the Chinese, I hasten to add. Those 11 original kilometers surrounded the new American and Chinese embassies and their road into town. So the diplomats had a nice ride. The rest of the citizens wallowed in mud a very great deal of the year. But when you look at reports of violence in South Sudan, the ongoing civil wars, the ongoing conflicts which seem unable to be resolved, well, you've got a very key question. How can you resolve those conflicts? Everyone is fighting for some benefit, but benefit objectively can't be delivered. So you've got not only a search for advantage in terms of the benefits of development, and the international community has put in a very great deal of aid to South Sudan. The uptake is not possible. But you want to be in a position to leverage such uptake that might, in the future, be possible. Now, these are problems that confront us as a policy-making nation with regard to a country like South Sudan. Then the Chinese, in terms of their fabled African policy, have got to do this 55 times over. So to take an interest in the continent is not an easy ask. And to try to generalize the continent, that's a lesson they had to learn not to do. The second major point I wanted to make is that Africa is not important to the Chinese. Okay, that's going to raise eyebrows. So let me immediately qualify that. Africa is not important to the Chinese in relative terms. Okay. So if you're going to say, which is the more important to Africa, leverage in the US economy, penetration in the European economy, being able to build the great One Belt, One Road, New Silk Road across Transcaucasia from China to the edges of Europe, the Maritime Silk Road linking up southern China through Pakistan, again, commandeering very large parts of the Indian Ocean, and their interests in the South China Seas. Every one of those things is more important than their interest in Africa. And you only have to look at the amount of budget that is being disposed of in those great projects and compare it with what is being disposed of in Africa to realize that although it's hugely significant what they're doing in Africa, is not as significant as what they're trying to do in other parts of the world. The Chinese have a world plan. This is true. If you go to Beijing, one of the things that's immediately noticeable is that you can cut through the air with a knife. It's our turn now. I'm Chinese. I buy into this. Why not? So it's palpable when you talk and you have to have meetings in certain circles. It's our turn now. But Africa is not the starting point. It's an important point. And so in our competitive desire to marginalize in our imaginations the role of China and Africa, because we need the minerals, we need the petroleum products too, don't we? And we're pretty pissed off that someone else is coming onto our colonial turf. A lot of black propaganda, for want of another term, is being employed in this. In terms of what the Chinese do, they're really good at infrastructure. We all know this: railways, communications networks, roads, civil engineering. Basically, the whole idea that's incarnate in the One Belt, One Road, New Silk Road initiative is, if that's successful, going to be a model for their penetration in other parts of the world. They're talking about it in Latin America. They're certainly beginning to sketch the possibility of this in Africa. And One Belt, One Road is that the one road is also the route, the corridor for a whole lot of other facility: railway, electronic communications, electricity cables. It's all there. It's all part of this one long corridor, with all kinds of facilities built along the way: schools, clinics. They even talk about universities, a basic infrastructure that makes development possible. What the One Belt, One Road initiative does, if you look at Africa, is that if you do top to tail, basically Cecil Rhodes' old Cape to Cairo idea, and you do it crossways as well, say from Nigeria through to Kenya, you bisect in two directions Democratic Republic of Congo. What this instantly means is that the most war-torn and ungovernable part of Africa becomes governable. The rebel groups have got nowhere to hide anymore. Think of the benefit this brings, not just to the extraction of minerals for Chinese benefit, but also to governance and the possibility of public administration, and the development of possibility for the populations living adjacent or near to the One Belt, One Road, with all of these infrastructural benefits, particularly of communications. It allows public administration. It upgrades everything at one particular stroke, something we never thought of after Cecil Rhodes exited the scene, now being revitalized in all its simplicity, but of course great complexity in terms of the execution. First of all, across Transcaucasia. Secondly, having a good look at what might be possible in other continents like Latin America and Africa. That's a piece of grandeur looking into the future. They've tried out a few infrastructural projects of some significance. The most famous is probably the Tazara Railway linking Zambia to the sea through Tanzania during the height of the Rhodesian White Rebellion, when the possibility of Zambia achieving its export and import goals through South Africa and Rhodesia was made hazardous, because Cecil Rhodes built all of those routes through white-controlled territory. Zambia, trying to take the side of the liberation movements, of course, was placed in a terrible position. If they were too vocal or too active in support of the liberation movements, the Rhodesians and the South Africans could strangle them just like that. So the Chinese built the Tazara Railway from Zambia to the sea, Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania. That was a very, very pioneering effort, in that for the first time, and almost the last time, you had Chinese and largely Zambian laborers working side by side. The model began to depart from that original egalitarian shared labor type of approach very rapidly afterwards, so that the Chinese introduced a model that is very much, we'll do the whole thing from beginning to end. We'll design it for you, we'll build it for you, we'll use our labor, there'll be no leakage, no corruption, you'll get it on time, they'll work according to Chinese labor law. Okay. This had huge advantages in that you got the project done. It came in on time, It came in on spec, no problem. There was no technology transfer. There was no employment creation. There was very little local share in terms of the design of the project. Whether or not consultation with the local communities that were affected were as deep and as profound as they should have been, that's another question entirely. This kind of model, in the end, caused sometimes as much harm as good. The Chinese are still rather wedded to this idea of being able to deliver on time and on spec, but are slowly taking on board ideas of technology transfer and local employment creation. There's been a slow learning curve, as I said, in terms of the slow learning curve that you saw also in high policy circles, as they essentially felt their way forward into Africa. Now, idealistically, they always wanted to be in Africa. From the 1955 Bandung Conference onwards, and you remember that at Bandung, Prime Minister Zhou Enlai gave a landmark speech about we will help our brothers around the world and not interfere in their internal affairs. The Bandung Conference being the antecedent of what became the non-aligned movement, at a time when the Chinese were diplomatic pariahs in the international community, denied their seat on the United Nations Security Council and things of that sort, a very long, decades-lasting quarrel with the United States in particular. The Chinese were looking for allies, diplomatic allies. One of the reasons why they're so partial to a country like Sudan, even with a very obnoxious president like President Bashir, is because Sudan was the fourth African country to recognize the People's Republic of China. It's a debt. They were paying the debt through their loyalty. It's like, why don't the Chinese do something about North Korea? Well, you'll remember during the Korean War, when the Americans took the side of what we now call the South and the Chinese came in on the side of the North, you ask anybody in the Chinese think tanks, why are you giving this very strange ruler of North Korea so much license and not simply say it's loyalty? Do you know how many hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers lost their lives in the struggle against the American support of the South? So this kind of loyalty is repaid, which also explains why they're still standing to a certain extent at the side of Robert Mugabe and his successor, Emerson Mnangagwa, in Zimbabwe. Long-standing relationships, long-standing alliances won't desert you in your hour of need, even if that hour of need was brought upon you by your own incompetence and your own lack of forward-looking policy. So the Chinese have this sense of being committed and a sense of Confucian obligation. Once you're in there, it's difficult to get yourself out of there. Okay, they're there for the long haul. What does this long haul consist in? Not every single country, of course, has got mineral wealth or petroleum wealth. A lot of it's upstream. What the Chinese will do is to put in a lot of sweetener up front for the sake of long-term prospecting and eventual long-term expropriation rights. Sometimes it never gets realized. What is upstream never comes downstream. Sometimes it does, and what it does is a payoff, of course. But this long game is not because the Chinese necessarily need the petroleum or the mineral resources now. Okay, they do to a certain extent. We all do to a certain extent. Their prognosis is that the industrial expansion in China will need it big time in 20 years from now. And this is one of the reasons precisely why the Americans are so paranoid about Chinese expansionism in Africa, because that's exactly the time frame when the Middle Eastern oil reserves start to run out. Where are we in the West going to get it from then? We won't have turned to hydrogen and wind farms and solar panel heating and electricity generation entirely by then. We've got too many lobbies with very old-fashioned sort of interests in fossil fuels. They'll still be very, very active in our body politics in 20 years from now. We'll be competing with the Chinese. And by that stage, their economic capacity will be very, very great, not least because they've bought upstream in Africa, but also they will have bought sufficiently inside our own economies to be able to leverage policy. Who rescued the Americans from the toxic debt that helped to lead on to the banking crisis, the financial crisis of 2008? That toxic debt was brought up by the Chinese. This is leverage for the future. Japanese people are pulling out of this country now. there's going to be a vacuum. We'll be inviting the Chinese in due course, and they'll come. So what you're looking at is a changing world scene in which Africa plays a major part. Now, having said all of that, do the Chinese drive a good bargain in Africa of constant benefit to the Africans? No. They can be very, very wicked sometimes. This is in two major ways. You've got to be able to negotiate. Any trade negotiation, any economic negotiation is a negotiation, end of story. You bring capacity to your side of the table. If you've not got capacity on your side of the table, don't blame the other side. They're there to get as good a bargain as possible. We do this. I'm amazed that we're surprised that other people do this. So, for instance, I addressed a meeting of all of the deputy governors of the central banks of Africa at one stage a few short years ago in Cape Town, one of these private conferences that didn't actually take place. These were people all in charge of their sovereign wealth funds, the long-term funds, the reserves of the nation for long-term investment. Something like 3 trillion gathered around the table, I would have thought, which is quite small fry compared to what the Chinese have, for instance, in terms of their reserves, something like, by my estimate, 60 trillion of reserves. That's $1 trillion, US value dollars. But even so, what you had were some very senior people making very significant financial decisions in Africa around the table in Cape Town. And over breakfast, the deputy governor of the Bank of Namibia came up to me and she said, "Can you look at this contract that the president has instructed us to sign with the Chinese for platinum exploration?" Now, I'm Chinese, I'm inscrutable. This is true. If I want to murder you, you would never know in 1,000 years from the expression on my face. It will come like a thief in the night. But my face must have turned white, okay, because as I was reading through the agreement, she looked in great anxiety towards me and said, "Is it that bad?" And I said, "Yeah, you guys have just been screwed." And I'm allowed to use language like that at breakfast time. And they were being absolutely hammered. The president wanted the deal signed for political reasons. Okay, the Chinese were getting the deal of all time. But this doesn't always happen. If there's pushback of a very, very well-practiced, well-researched sort. Now, in fact, the pushback is epitomized by Angola, of all places. Their pushback in terms of the negotiations with the Chinese is immaculate. We don't know anything about this because we don't speak foreign languages in this country. We think if we keep going back to Brussels and we say it ever more slowly and more loudly, then people will understand this word backstop. But, yeah, sorry, I had to say that. But the Portuguese-speaking countries, of course, the official language of Angola is Portuguese. What they're doing is, of course, recorded in Portuguese. We don't read it. Foreign Office research capacity in Lusophonic affairs is very, very limited. But what they're able to do in terms of pushback and negotiating with the Chinese is an example to others. So if they can do it, what you're seeing, I think, is the dawn of a new African capacity to negotiate with the Chinese on far more like equal terms. Okay, now having said that, the second major fly in the ointment of the Chinese penetration of Africa is not so much the Chinese government. They're trying to be clean and honest, even if they can take the Namibians for a ride from time to time. But it's private entrepreneurs and private corporations. The Chinese have sent a huge number of private corporations into Africa, and they're sometimes totally disastrous in terms of their cultural appreciation, and for want of any possible diplomatic words, are sometimes downright vulgar in their racism. They just don't get it, that you have to treat people decently and not according to received stereotypes, which exist even in China, as it exists in many parts of our European and North Atlantic worlds. So a lot of these corporations and private entrepreneurs, private business people have done incalculable damage to the profile of China, and made, in fact, the Chinese presence into election issues in African election campaigns. Zambia being a case in point. The late President Michael Sata took, I think, 4 if not 5 attempts to win the presidency. He was very, very dogged. He kept trying until finally he did win it and then died in office. But at least he made it. And in one of the early election campaigns, he made the Chinese into an issue. He said, if you elect me, I'm going to kick them out. Eventually, he was elected. And he said to his vice president, look, I'm a bit tarnished by what I've said in the past. You as vice president better handle our relationships with the Chinese. The vice president was Guy Scott, who on the death of Michael Sata became temporarily the only white president of Africa. He stood down before substantive elections were held. But what Guy did was something very, very simple. He compulsorily convened all of the senior Chinese business personalities in Zambia, particularly those in the mining sector, and then brought in Chinese-speaking experts who were educated on the spot to be well-versed in Zambian labor law. And in these compulsory seminars, the Chinese mine managers in particular had the Riot Act read to them in terms of the detailed legislation that governed employment conditions, health and safety conditions, etc., in the mining sector. And because it was done in Chinese language, they got hit. And the kinds of problems that were faced in Zambian industrial relations with the Chinese, they didn't go away, of course. Miracles don't happen just like that. But there was a significant and conspicuous decline in terms of the frequency and the seriousness of breakdowns in relationships between the mine workers and the Chinese mine managers and mine owners. Finding a common ground actually means a certain cross-cultural sympathy and empathy, not just the Chinese towards the Africans, but the Africans have got to learn Chinese, as do we, because they're coming. And this is something which has now been learned. You won't find an African delegation negotiating in Beijing now without Chinese expertise in the delegation. And so, as all of you know, many of you will have had experience at high level in government or in diplomacy. The plenary negotiations are very often just a formality. You've got to be able to eavesdrop on the chatter behind closed doors, in the washrooms, this kind of thing. And if you don't have linguistic capacity, you're not going to be able to do that. Now African delegations do. And I think that, again, this is one of those small, incremental, but meaningful steps forward to a more equal relationship of the Angolan sort that will mark the next stage of negotiations with the Chinese. What's the future? Well, it's going to be competitive. We need Africa as well. The Africans are getting their act together, some obviously much faster than others. And we're going to have an election in Nigeria. It was meant to have been last weekend. It wasn't. It was postponed because of logistical reasons. They're going to try to hold it this coming weekend. It seems at first sight to be a country that is governed by chaos as much as by a president and his government. But at the same time, when you look underneath the surface, the actual capacity of Nigeria as an economic force is amazing. It's just that all this capacity declines, is disinclined to join government. You know, why should it? It could make much more money outside of government, even if sometimes by irregular means. But the fact that the former governor of the central bank, Mr. Sanusi, became the emir of Kano, and before he became the emir of Kano, he had to leave the central bank because he called out the former president himself, Goodluck Jonathan, for corruption. So it was not safe for him to remain in post. He had to become the emir of Kano, a traditional post to which he was entitled, for protection. You don't dare take on the population again of a huge state in Nigeria with problems of its own, of an Islamic and a conservative nature. He's taking his agenda of modernity there. But before he did that, when he was governor of the central bank, he was voted the best central bank governor in the world by other central bank governors. What you've got is an emerging capacity in Africa, not in all places, but in many places like Nigeria, the richest, the largest, most diverse, or one of the most diverse parts of Africa. Countries that should be performing that level but which are not, and which are conspicuous disappointments like South Africa, for instance, may yet rise up the curve. The South Africans themselves have their own problems with the Chinese. The Chinese took them for a ride as well in terms of the textile industry. The local textile industry was overwhelmed by Chinese cheap imports. Well, you can't do that. You can't let that happen. So there has to be an upping of game. And this upping of game can't come in an isolated way. As part of the upping of game of the capacity to be a government in all respects. When that starts to happen, when there's an upping of game with the Chinese, it's going to be a signal of an upping of game in all of these other ways that are important in terms of what a government is meant to deliver for its citizens. If the Chinese provoke this kind of upwards, better way of addressing problems of government, then they will have done a huge service to Africa. Okay, let me just conclude by one or two small stories. The Chinese have yet got to learn a number of lessons about how to do it in Africa. They've got almost no reporting capacity to do with opposition movements. Okay, so when there's a sudden change in government, they don't have intelligence on the person who's become president because he came from an opposition party. It's regarded as not good diplomatic practice to compile dossiers on the leader of the opposition and the prospective front bench from the opposition party. The Chinese don't have a democratic model. In some ways, it's alien for them to even think that this is something that you should do. But they need to do that, otherwise they're going to be taken by surprise. Okay. The second thing is they're not really very, very good at adjusting to other people's models. It's a Chinese model. They're very, very chauvinistic. So all of the scholarships they're now handing out to young African people to go study in China, they're teaching them to be little Chinese citizens once they get to China. So the whole idea of these people being the seeds of a new multiculturalism in China itself, that's greatly discouraged. Which means that unfortunately, although there have been huge improvements, you're going to get as much ignorance sometimes among the young people of China towards the outside world, as was the case with their elders and betters before them. So some things might have lag in terms of how the Chinese approach the future. There's not going to be something even. If Africa puts on a growth spurt of its own and becomes greatly attractive, even if by what are essentially cartoon films like Black Panther, which if you've seen it, you will have understood it was shot entirely in Argentina, not at all in Africa. And if you understand any of the local languages and you think, what are they speaking? Okay, they're speaking Xhosa, a South African language, interspersed sometimes with smatterings of Swahili. It's like, okay, these people won't know the difference between English and a few Finnish words thrown into it, will they? And Black Panthers don't exist in South Africa. They actually don't exist in Africa at all. They're black leopards, not black panthers of the jaguar sort in South America. The film was a travesty. At the same time, it evoked interest in Africa, not only on the part of people in this part of the world, but in China. It may be that that kind of false glamour, but all the same could be a necessary glamour, will be the next step forward in terms of a cultural appreciation of what is possible in terms of better diplomatic and better economic relationships between the two great continents. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed for that. I would just sort of echo, I think, the sort of part of what you were saying, that China's approach to Africa is not monolithic. This is entirely coincidental, but I worked on Sudan myself slightly later than Stephen, and my Chinese counterpart was very good to work with. It was just after, you may remember, a terrorist attack on an oil installation in Algeria, and the Chinese discovered that they had liabilities there because they had workers. And they then set about trying to find out what other liabilities they might have elsewhere in Africa, and discovered all kinds of things that the government had been completely oblivious to. So he told me that they discovered they had $4 billion worth of investment in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this alarmed them because they hadn't known anything about it. So they investigated and were initially relieved to discover it was only $2 billion, and then after a bit more investigation found out that it was actually 6. And so the idea that there is a monolithic Chinese approach here is a surprising myth to people who, like me, spend their lives in diplomatic circles, thinking in relatively cartoon terms, I suppose. But that's sort of by the way. Can I take questions, please? Who would like to?
If I can just add to the little comment we had before we started, questions if I might. Pakistan, so I understand, Saudi Arabia is going to fill a 10 billion gap, part of which is money owed to China. Now, Americans getting very upset, as you might expect, saying the IMF will not respond to this. Saudi Arabia seems to be getting into the situation of helping out. My question is, when something's going wrong, everything doesn't go right, how does China react? First question. Second question is, internally within China, how is this fantastic initiative perceived with all the money going out of China externally? Some might say it could be better spent in China.
Okay, let me address that, because those are two very good and slightly complex questions. The question of money leaving China doesn't really impinge upon public debate in China. I mean, public debate is probably a misnomer, because you can only debate so far without getting into trouble in China, and you certainly can't be highly critical of the government on a consistent basis. There's a lack of understanding about Africa, but everyone accepts at the government's word that this will bring long-term benefits to China. The Chinese are not exactly exposing themselves in any disastrous economic fashion in Africa, despite American trade wars and things like that. What the Chinese are sitting on, as I said, is some $60 trillion worth of reserves, divided roughly equally between domestic reserves and foreign reserves. So they can ride out pretty much any storm. And I think they're going to continue to be committed to their profile of upfront blessings to African jurisdictions, sweeteners up front before any kind of extracted benefit occurs further down the line. I don't see any real change in that model, and I don't see any opposition to that model. Okay, in terms of, well, Saudi Arabia, I've just come back from Qatar. They're not particular friends of Saudi Arabia, of course, right now, given the Saudi blockade of Qatar. I think what you've got is the Crown Prince, Mohammed Salman, out there making friends in the light of the diplomatic difficulties he's facing on a number of fronts. The kickback against the way he's conducted the war in Yemen, for instance. A lot of kickback in Turkey in terms of the assassination of Khashoggi on Turkish soil. And of course, the Qatarians are very, very angry that the blockade has been launched against them. So rather than retreat from any of his ill-advised foreign policy initiatives, I think Prince Salman has tried to make diplomatic friends elsewhere. Now, there's a symmetry here. Islamic country. That's part of a normal profile of these kinds of transactions for Saudi Arabia. But also, yes, of course, to try to have influence in a country that could be an important ally in the future. It won't really affect the Chinese presence in Pakistan. It's more likely to offend the Americans in the sense of the very ambivalent American approach to Pakistan, using that as a conduit to finance certain insurrectionary groups in Afghanistan, for instance, and to find that turned against them at later parts of history. And of course, what it's done is empowered the Pakistani security services, particularly their intelligence services, so they've become almost a republic unto themselves, ungovernable by the elected government of Pakistan. So who uses the money that is going to be made available by the Saudis is a question. What security issues will be addressed underneath the aegis of which institution in Pakistan is another issue. The Chinese are committed themselves to Pakistan, not least because of their maritime version of the New Silk Road. So apart from going overland and Transcaucasia, they want to build a maritime route. This has really spooked the Americans. They're very frightened of the entirety of the 2 Chinese aircraft carriers that are now going to be plying the seas from Pakistan to the Arabian Gulf. What you've got is building 3 transport networks from southern China through Pakistan in order to reach the sea. Okay, and major port facilities being built and upgraded in the southern part of Pakistan. The Chinese have done this in a very naive way, so that the most important of the 3 transport networks runs adjacent to the western border of Pakistan. Okay. So what you've got there is for the entire northern part of that transport network, largely railway, being adjacent to Afghanistan and the insurrectionary groups there. The bottom half of it goes through Baluchistan, a Pakistan province, which is the site of local insurrections, the poorest province in Pakistan. It's been long deprived in terms of funds coming from the center of Pakistani political and economic life. And so there's a rebel group there under arms. And when I pointed this out to the Chinese, they had not thought of this, that their investments, their building, would be underneath that kind of threat, exactly what our chairman was saying. That hadn't occurred to them. So it's really more the naivety of the Chinese that still needs to fully disappear, rather than rivalry from a regional power wanting to have more global influence, such as Saudi Arabia. As for Saudi Arabia, in the long term, all the contradictions in that country are going, at some stage, to have to come home to roost. What shape that coming home to roost is going to take is something which is quite implausible in terms of my imagination right now, but I think that we're going to have trouble in that part of the world.
Thank you.
How much do you think that doing business, Western companies and Western governments wanting to do business and have influence in China is held back by the bribery and corruption legislation that we're held to and American companies are held to, compared to Chinese government or Chinese corporations or private organizations that apparently can happily ignore those and just go charging in and talking to undesirable governments like Guinea-Bissau, etc. Is that really true, or is it just the fact that they've got a hell of a lot more money than everybody else, and that's the way they're getting the influence?
It's true to an extent. It's also slightly exaggerated, because what you've got now is a slow but discernible Chinese shift in the way that they disperse funding. So it's changing slowly but surely, as I said, from a state-to-state benefaction, a grant. Okay. It's now increasingly taking the shape of liquidity made available as a soft loan from a Chinese bank. Okay, it may be a state-owned bank or a bank with majority state ownership in terms of the shareholding and things of that nature, but it's still a bank, which means that it's got to function as banks do, even if on extremely generous long terms. It's still got to have an assets to lending ratio that makes sense in banking terms and good banking practice. So that's going to become very, very much, I think, a constraint upon wholesale leakage to corrupt figures in government. The new international Chinese funds, we've got these funds set up for the Pacific, for instance, Asia Pacific, thinking about setting these things up all around the world. They're endowment of a very great deal of the funding of the BRICS Bank, for instance. They're basically disposing of roughly 50 billion at a time, a sum which is totally impossible for us to contemplate here in the West anymore, or particularly in this country. But they can afford to do this. But these will be like regional equivalents of the World Bank or the IMF. There'll be conditionality. You can't operate these funds or these banks in any other way. What you've got is an upscaling of the availability of Chinese liquidity. So it starts slowly but surely to emulate Western models of lending. They'll be very careful not to apply the same level of conditionality as many Western institutions, and they'll be really careful not to apply political conditionalities, you must be democratic or else type of thing. They'll be much more subtle than that. But fiscal responsibilities and fiscal conditions will certainly be part of the next, say, 10 years of the Chinese turn to this kind of making available of liquidity. Leakage, well, yes, we've got all these laws, and we're not meant to leak too much to potentates and hangers-on around the world. You know very well that there are ways of doing this. The Foreign Office knows very well how it happens as well. And ladies and gentlemen, you'll be pleased to know that a very great deal of the economy of the City of London depends on our accountants and our lawyers basically facilitating, let us say, interesting transactions, shadow companies, laundered money going through no end of companies, one after another, that do no other purpose on earth but to make themselves available for the laundering of money. And if the Somali pirates can do this, a sophisticated government can do it in an even more complex fashion. If you want to be corrupt, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing on earth we can do to stop it.
Investment supposes that you want to get your money back at some point. Could you compare the Chinese state corporations' view on the term at which they expect to get money back with the Chinese private entities, and then compare those again with the West and show how these views affect what's happening behind them?
In terms of Chinese public institutions, and even banks that are majority owned by the Chinese state, but which do have some kind of private element to them, they can afford to take a more subsidized view of the long-term future, as it were, but they can't rely on that completely. They do need to have a balance sheet at the end of the day, as I said, that resembles the balance sheet of any normal bank, not least because of interbank lending and interbank, as it were, transfers of liquidity. The whole world depends on this. It was only when we stopped lending to Greek banks, for instance, that the chaos broke out in terms of the Greek banking crisis. But even Chinese banks participate in terms of the interbank lending processes. So they have to play a game like banks normally do. Now, in terms of fully private Chinese corporations, although it's actually very rare to find a large corporation that is entirely free of some kind of shareholding on the part of the state, they still tend to be self-contained entities, so that the huge number of construction companies that you see with Chinese colors around Africa doing a very good job in terms of their building. Usually they're involved in building office blocks, large sort of multi-story complexes of one sort or another, very good at building sports stadiums. And the Francophonic countries very good at building opera houses, believe it or not. That shows our stereotyping of African cultural audiences, doesn't it? You can't believe that there are opera houses in Africa. The Chinese will build those huge projects. They've been very, very active in Addis Ababa, of course, the home of the African Union. They've built the Secretariat buildings for the African Union. They donated this terrible golden statue of Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of African Pan-Africanism. Only the Chinese would donate a golden statue. So they're present everywhere, and it works in this self-contained model. It's still very much reminiscent of what I said was that we'll do it all type of thing. There is some knock-on benefit now to local providers, to local subcontractors and things of that nature, but it's still essentially a one-stop shop, the Chinese engineer, the Chinese builders, etc., etc. Whether they'll depart from that model or not, I don't know. The real damage is caused not by those companies that operate with that kind of scale. You have to have some sort of major scale to build a skyscraper, for instance. It's the smaller entrepreneurial business people who run small factories, people who have got small retail outlets, things of that nature. There's a huge multiplicity of those now in many, many African countries, and these are the ones that are very anxious not to abide by any legislative and regulatory frameworks, and who are causing a very great deal of damage, particularly in terms of labor relations.
Yeah, lady in the
Thanks a lot for the really interesting talk. I wanted to ask, back in the 1990s, I was living in Shanghai and encountered an astonishing group of, they weren't really a group, but an astonishing bunch of Africans who were studying in Shanghai. They had been sent to Shanghai because they were top of the class. And the scholarships available from the Chinese government meant that if they were going to study chemistry, the chance for them to do it was in China. So they were expected to very rapidly learn fantastic Chinese, and then they were merrily doing degrees in chemistry and all sorts of other things in Chinese with Chinese classmates. They were an amazing group of people. Mali seemed to be the place that sent most of them. And it's obviously a long time ago now, and I've often wondered, since then, what happened to those people? Because they were incredibly talented people with amazing skills. Have you encountered Malians with amazing Chinese? What did they do? Did they go into business? Or I've always wondered what happened to them.
Well, the Malians probably didn't go back, for the most part, to Mali. This is the problem. If they went to other parts of Africa, then obviously there's a continental uptake in terms of their skills. Many of them would have gone to places like Silicon Valley, for instance, if they were doing electronic engineering degrees. There will be a long-term benefit in that even if they join the African diaspora in non-African countries, then remittances home and things like that is very often the lifeline of families back home. I mean, I pleaded with the Foreign Office here for years to try to use its influence on the Home Office not to deport Zimbabweans, many of whom were in the country illegally or on grounds of political asylum that could not be sustained. But if you wanted to keep Robert Mugabe in power forever, then send them home, because their remittances were financing their families who would otherwise not have survived, and these families were the bedrock of support for the opposition. So there's all kinds of knock-on effects that we often don't fully contemplate. In terms of what's happening with Africans in China now, well, the ones who went to Shanghai were lucky, they got the golden delights of a very, very cosmopolitan city, and has always been the most cosmopolitan city in China. The Chinese practice now is to devote most of their scholarships to rural universities. This is not to say they're not multi-faculty universities, but basically keep the Africans out of sight. Let them not be embarrassing as a huge population in the big cities. There still are Africans in the big universities in the big cities, but increasingly the scholarships in the university places are for minor universities in the backwaters, as it were. There's been a huge influx of African traders in China, largely in Guangzhou. This is impossible to, what we used to call Canton. This is almost impossible to quantify, maybe up to 250,000, if not more, Africans living in Guangzhou, many of them illegally. They've overstayed their visas. The amount of trade of a small nature that they're able to transact between China and their home countries is very, very significant in terms of the availability of goods, for instance, in their home countries. And there are some African businessmen who are operating on a large scale in China. Maletsi Mbeki, the brother of the former South African President Thabo Mbeki, at one stage was using South African capital to ranch cattle in Sudan for export live to China. He was making millions out of this. And it was not just a one country to one country type of transaction. You have 3 countries involved here. And that seems to be an increasing model that we've not kept track on. It's not just which countries do business between one continent and the other, but sources of inputs from different parts of that continent for the final end product to wind up in China. Whether or not there's something like that at the Chinese end as well, multi-sourcing of various component parts, I don't know. I would doubt it. But Africa, precisely because it's got 55 different countries, it makes it possible and sometimes desirable to do this multi-sourcing of inputs for the final product that winds up in China. But precisely for that reason, trying to trace back how much African business is done in China that originates from Africa, that's a very, very hard tracer study to accomplish for those reasons.
At the beginning of your talk, you should distinguish between the government, the party, the army, all these various very important constituents. If that's right, can it be said there is such a thing as a Chinese strategy to these competing organisations? If so, what is that strategy?
I think that there's now a coalescence of the greatest amount of expertise in the Prime Minister's department, the State Council, sort of like our Cabinet Office. They have a think tank, which is part of their institutional sort of setup, in which you've got the usual researchers that we would have, say, in the Research Analysts Department in our Foreign Office, for instance. But it's aided by senior retired ambassadors to African locations. And so their research office there in the State Department would be organized in groupings, each one underneath the supervision of someone who's actually had ambassadorial experience in China. So you've got, as it were, the best of research and experience. Now, these are not just ordinary ambassadors, they've all got PhDs as well. So they're a very, very educated cadre of diplomatic personnel. So they're trying to put this kind of fusion in terms of expertise into their background research. In terms of a policy, because there are 55 different countries, it's impossible to have one policy. And they've had trouble, as I've tried to suggest, in differentiating how to approach individual countries. They're slowly getting over that, but it does mean they've got to upgrade their reporting capacity in terms of their individual diplomatic missions in every single country. Now, those of you who've been involved in diplomatic life would surely have gone to a cocktail party or two thrown by the Chinese ambassador. And of course, these are fortresses. The Americans are obviously emulating this. If you go to Battersea and see how many floors they've dug underneath that are bomb-proof, 5 floors of bomb-proof basement by my last count. I live just opposite the new embassy, so I've been counting. The Chinese model of the walled city. And the diplomats there, to a certain extent, prisoners as much as representing their country in a foreign country. They don't actually get out and about very much in that foreign country, which means their political reportage can be absolutely superficial and dreadful, concentrating only on reportage of the government and, as I said, not of the opposition. So there's got to be greater license and, in fact, very much clearer instructions to the Chinese embassies that political reportage is a sophisticated affair of the sort that we conduct. So much so that, yes, it's true, a very great number of our so-called second secretaries are, in fact, let us say, seconded from interesting organizations like MI6, for instance. The Americans also, from the CIA. Everybody does this. You have professional intelligence gatherers, and the Chinese don't, and they need to do that, not for the sake of pernicious reasons, but very much just simply for the sake of understanding what's going on in terms of local governments and the volatility of local governments. Strategy, I don't know. They have got to have a holistic strategy that fits the continent. That's almost impossible.
You talked about the great Chinese efficiency in implementing infrastructure. One type of infrastructure that's transformed many parts of Africa in the last 10 to 15 years is mobile telephony. But then, of course, associated with that is social media, which is not an area which the Chinese are terribly happy with. So I wonder if you could say something about that.
Okay. Despite all the problems right now with Huawei phones, it's better than an Android, okay? Those of you who are not up on your mobile telephony, just go to a car phone warehouse and just try it out, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, if you're not into social media because you're of a certain generation, or you're a certain generation that's still locked on Facebook and you don't understand all the rest of social media that exists, just talk to your children, and if you can stand it after half an hour, you'll understand the huge wealth of capacity that these things can command. You couldn't sell a Huawei phone, however, to any member of the younger generation unless it was capable of absorbing the download of apps to do with social media. So the hard unit is one thing. What it is able to do is another thing. And it has to be able to download the apps that give you access to social media. So no matter what the Chinese want to do in terms of their own local domestic restriction of being able to go online to certain sites, this is almost impossible to police once the hard unit leaves the jurisdiction of China. So you're going to get throughout Africa what we call cell phone penetration. We're now doing, as it were, country profile studies that have all of the usual data, per capita income, gross national product, longevity, average age of life expectancy, levels of literacy, all of that kind of usual data. And we've added to it cell phone penetration, because what this does is to open up everything. I've seen in the middle of the rural areas largely illiterate farmers who, all the same, were numerate, transferring rural credit to their bank accounts using their cell phones. Yeah, a major incentive to be able to learn how to use these things, of course. You get your credits without the middleman raking off his or her percentage. And so much of the opposition to President Mugabe and now against President Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, a country with which I'm very close, is organized on WhatsApp. You know, everyone has got WhatsApp. If any of you are asking what's WhatsApp, then you really do need to have a talk to your children or grandchildren. Okay, you need to get onto WhatsApp. Okay.
Are you saying the Chinese are completing networks, or is it still down the Vodafone and
the cell phone has got to have the capacity for the end user to be able to download the apps that will get them onto social media, and that's dead easy to do. You know.
Going to have to draw it to a close there, because we're almost out of time. Stephen, thank you very much indeed for that. It's an enormously stimulating lecture, and we're very pleased to have had you here. I hope we can do more similar things in future. Thank you very much.